It seems the yoga world is waking up, but there are still some styles and lineages who will get annoyed at the idea that yoga might not be perfect as it is for women in peri and post-menopause.
I'm Anne Marie McQueen, journalist and proud 50-ish woman, and we are here looking for the true truth in perimenopause, menopause, midlife, and beyond.
Opening our minds to other possibilities is not always easy.
Hop, I think.
You're all woman to me. All right, Anne Marie.
Well, okay, I don't know how long we've circled around each other on social media. You're one of my favorite, smartest, most reasonable, common sense, bright lights. Like you're just amazing. I just absolutely love everything you do. So congratulations for being that person.
Yeah, and it's the same for me with you that I read some of your posts and your Substack and I'm thinking, oh, that's definitely Anne Marie's stance. And then you'll post something that makes me go, oh, and that's also possible. I like that you are willing to call out the caller outers. It's not just, yeah, you're not plodding a dictatorial path. And I guess that's the journalist in you, that you are able to see behind most issues that are presented and just, yeah, be a bit of an original thinker and pull it apart without
Well,
feeling
that's what
like
I'm
you have
trying.
to. Yeah.
I don't want to ever have
Journalist.
people say, oh, she would say that. You see a lot of people on
Mm.
social media and you're like, oh, they would say that because I don't know. That's my
Yeah,
goal.
you don't read things afresh. You think, oh, this is this person posting, so I'm just not going to read it from the offset, or I'm going to get angry before I even start reading it.
I'm
Yeah,
going to predict what they're going to say and how they're going to say it. Yeah. We do a
yeah.
little bit of that. Okay, so you have written a book, Yoga for Menopause and Beyond. You've been educating people in this space, which you say in the book is niche, but I don't know that it's that niche because I feel I went to a yoga class a couple of weeks ago. It was all midlife women, just a few young women. I feel like midlife women are so much a part of yoga. And I also feel that there's so many practitioners that we come across that need to be educated the way you're educating people in this book, like massage
Hmm.
therapists and physio and trainers and all fitness class teachers and many more, where women
Yeah.
are just coming across and people aren't educated about what perimenopause is. So just tell me a little bit about, you have a certificate for teaching yoga and for the stages of menopause. Just tell me a little bit about how you found your way into this part of yoga.
As you can imagine, as most of us who are now working in the menopause space, it often begins with our own perimenopause journey, which is what happened for me. So around, I think 2015, and it's funny how these things disappear into the mist of time. You think you're going to remember the moment forever, but I could say it was 2014, 16, a bit like when did I have my first period? No idea. Anyway, around that time, which would have been about 45, but I would have been 45 if it was 2015, starting to notice my own symptoms. But though I knew the word perimenopause existed, I didn't really know what was truly happening. And so I definitely had the fear coming up. I knew that hot flushes existed, or as we call them over here, hot flushes. You guys call them hot flashes in North America, and some anxiety. Not much else, to be honest, but I was scared health-wise. My mum died very young. And though I knew perimenopause was a thing, I went to the doctor to say, look, can you do all the blood tests to make sure I'm not dying of some mystery disease or some other thing that we all worry about, those things like we worry about cancer and Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's and stuff like that. So they did all the tests, and when the doctor, a junior doctor, rang me with the results, he said, everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's normal. The only thing that was slightly different was your FSH. And I said, oh, does that mean I'm in menopause, in perimenopause? And he said, maybe. And I said, oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. And he probably was totally taken aback by the fact that I was thanking him for telling me I was in perimenopause. And I know now that one test of high FSH doesn't diagnose perimenopause, but for me it was enough at the time in with my level of knowledge for me not to be afraid anymore. And then didn't I start researching and researching because I'm curious. Once something occurs to me, I want to know about it. And recognizing that it wasn't just perimenopause that created symptoms, and that, of course, nervous system dysregulation is a thing, and yoga is well placed to help regulate the nervous system. And so I started thinking, okay, yoga could really help. And then I also recognized as I started to investigate what are now becoming known as the musculoskeletal, is becoming known as musculoskeletal syndrome of menopause. I don't know whether that term will ever be taken up, but while I was investigating those physical changes, I thought, hang on a minute. So that means that yoga also has the potential to do more harm for women in peri and post-menopause than it might have to the same woman in her 20s and 30s or before surgical or early onset menopause. So I really started to feel that it wasn't just that yoga as it stood was going to be beneficial for perimenopause experiences, but I felt that there needed to be some adjustments made, some stuff chucked, and some potentially new stuff added. So I also looked into all the sort of research on anything that is really outside of medicine and what could reasonably be put into a yoga class to enhance a yoga class. So I would say it's a sort of deconstruction of a normal yoga class and practice, letting go of some of the bits that may not serve women in this stage, and then it is a reconstruction of it with some additional yummies. So it took me about 5 years of research and development and bringing this stuff to my regular students. And then in 2020, I wrote and launched the teacher training Yoga for Menopause. And at the time, I thought I was the only person in the world doing that. It turned out there was someone on parallel tracks doing a similar thing as well, and she launched just before me. And this was way before I was conversant with social media, and only found out about her because the lockdown started at that point and everybody just went online. And so everything started to be visible online. So for, I think, about those first 3 years, we were still the only ones running a Yoga for Menopause teacher training. And now there's a few more. And I remember thinking, I am bashing my head against the brick wall of the yoga world, the bits of the yoga world that decided that yoga is perfect and leave it alone and it must never be changed, not really listening to its own philosophies of connecting to the truth of what it is to be oneself. And the truth of what it is to be a woman is that we experience huge change in quite a concertinaed, a concentrated time. And at that point, our yoga practice needs to change for it to still be accessible and relevant to us. So now it seems the yoga world is waking up, but there are still some styles and lineages who will get annoyed at the idea that yoga might not be perfect as it is for women in peri and postmenopause. So I'm here to continue banging that drum.
Yeah, the yoga world is probably like any other world, right? When you try to change
Yeah.
things, yeah, no one likes it.
So it can be a bit stickier in something like yoga, which is to some degree faith-based. So there are lineage traditions where teachings are handed down from guru to guru over hundreds of years or 100 years or whatever. And questioning the practices is not up for grabs. You just do. You do the practice. And then there is the sort of more Western model where people are willing to maybe, and no, I shouldn't say the more Western model because plenty of those heavily traditional roots are in the West as well. But I would say I'm more out of the bag of yoga therapy, which is using yoga for health and being rather than going on a yogic path for spiritual enlightenment. And
Okay.
that's more willing to change. But I think some traditions are a bit heels dug in a bit more than other things, like you're saying, that don't want to see change.
Okay, so for women who, like, my concern about yoga has always been that there's a million different kinds of teachers and practitioners, and I always have worried about someone just being like lost, as I have been, as other people, and Googling. I used to use the example of a guy who's going through a divorce, who was just clueless, saying, what will relax me, finding yoga, ending up in a certain person's class, the kind of person that I've known that teaches yoga. There's different kinds of yoga teachers. There are amazing yoga teachers. There's guru type yoga teachers. There's insincere yoga teachers. There's yoga teachers teaching from ego. There's all sorts of that stuff. So I guess knowing that, what do you want women to know when they go to yoga? First of all, we're assuming a woman knows she's in perimenopause. That's the first thing, because they don't always know. But if a woman knows she's in perimenopause, what would you like her to know going in if her teacher isn't informed?
If you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know I'm a root cause girl at heart. And when we dive into what makes us function, you get right down to our mitochondria. They are like the battery pack for our cells. That means they're our power source. And don't you want to do a little house cleaning on your power source? MitoPure by Timeline contains a rare postbiotic urothalin A, and it works by promoting a process of cellular cleanup that clears out dysfunctional mitochondria. MitoPure's own testing has shown improvements in energy levels, recovery time, endurance, and more. Timeline is offering 10% off your order of MitoPure. Go to timeline.com/hotflash. That's timeline.com/hotflash.
So many things. One, that she deserves and is allowed, in air quotes, to advocate for her changing body. And that involves, for example, if she feels confident to tell her teacher that she is in perimenopause and that she is experiencing whatever it is she's experiencing, and that she's finding that she needs a new approach to her physical practice, for example, or that she is no longer comfortable in Shavasana, the resting pose at the end. She no longer feels comfortable on her back with her eyes closed. She feels too anxious. So at the very least, to advocate for herself, whether it's verbally or refusing to be adjusted and pushed and prodded into the places that her teacher feels she should go, and to be able to say, no, I really prefer to lie on my side, thank you. If a teacher saying, no, Shavasana's on your back, close your eyes, which is what I used to do as a rookie teacher. So to advocate for herself as courageously as she can, but I think also to feel able, now that these trainings do exist, to say to her teacher, would you at least read up on it, please? I've discovered this book, or I know there's loads online. Could you read up on it from your professional standpoint and see what way you need to care for me? Most teachers should have a health questionnaire when a new student joins. They should probably, if they have women in their 40s plus, which, by the way, Anne Marie, is the largest single demographic in terms of gender and age, is women over 40 doing yoga. That's like massive. Yeah.
Well, any class I go to.
And you see it. Yeah, exactly. You see it. So I think that she has a right and a reason to say to her teacher, your students are going to meet this stage. I wonder, would you be interested in looking it up for me, because you have more knowledge about yoga and the physical body than I do? Because a teacher would have, as I say, a questionnaire, and probably should give that questionnaire more regularly as women and men in their classes reach midlife, because that's when stuff starts to happen for both genders. And for example, if I have someone fill in a health form and they say they have, I don't know, an autoimmune disease, or they say they have, in my rookie days before I knew easily, high blood pressure, or they're pregnant, I'll go away and I'll research it so I know that I'm keeping them safe. So if somebody ticks perimenopause, if you have that in your health questionnaire box, do you know your menopausal status? Are you in perimenopause, post-menopause? And you could even have a little subsection. Do you have joint pain? Do you have, etc.? Do you have osteoporosis? Should always be in there. And I think it's incumbent upon a student to keep their teacher up to date. But a lot of teachers don't even go there. They assume that yoga is just there to be done by everyone. And even this phrase, yoga is for everybody, does not include really adjusting it for everybody. There's a certain degree of, if you can't do this, then don't. But that's a really uncreative way, to my mind, of keeping people who have challenges with you. I think you need to be offering them positives as well. So I think it's an advocate. Your question is, what should a woman going into class do? Advocate for yourself, express to your teacher the changes that are going on. Ask them, can they do some research, or are you happy? Or are they happy for you to do some research and hand it to them? And yeah, I guess that's kind of it. But in terms of your own practice on the mat, to stop when you want to stop, to keep moving when you want to keep moving. So if you are in a restful pose and you feel agitated, just wriggle your fingers and toes, have a little squirm on the mat if that feels good for you. Keep your eyes open if you want. Don't do the breathing practices if they make you feel anxious, because they can do, or do more breathing practices because they make you feel good, even if the teacher isn't guiding them. But that's for a yoga student who is experienced and can pick and choose. Whereas for a beginner, they need, if they're going for perimenopausal reasons, they need to look for someone who understands that already, at the very least, because of physical changes, and then more generally because of nervous system changes, because of changes of the experience of joy in the body and in life, and for community and understanding and education. And it's such a rich potential. And I do say to yoga teachers, and I also, by the way, you were mentioning that the book, you feel there's information in there that should be given to a lot of other professionals who work with women. And I do trainings for Pilates teachers and and personal trainers, also psychotherapists and counselors. And I do feel that there are more people becoming informed. And I've actually lost my train of thought there, funnily enough. What was I saying? Something about God, I'm completely lost there.
Other trainers,
Yeah,
what a
something
woman,
about, oh,
she's
that
going
was it.
anywhere. Yeah.
That's a wonderful menopause moment, Anne
Oh
Marie,
my God.
especially that you
Yeah.
saved me.
There's so
It
much
was
up
that,
here. Of course it happens.
I
We've got
know.
so many files from so
And
many
that's
years.
one of the things I teach my teachers, is to not hide it in their classes, because they don't then make themselves other than their students. But what I was going to say was that a yoga teacher, a personal trainer, psychotherapist, a Pilates instructor may be the professional in a woman's life who she sees the most regularly, the health and being professional, they say, the most regularly. And for that person to be menopause informed and to be able to support people with a bit of extra knowledge, a bit of extra compassion and empathy, understanding of what they're going through, create that community, give relevant practices to that person. That's incredible. How often do people go see their doctor? 10 minutes, once every 6 months maximum. So I think, as much as it might sound like I'm selling my product, I do think people who work with women over 40 have a responsibility to really know. And they
Yeah.
have such an opportunity to make a difference.
We Now I've lost my train of thought.
Yay!
When we're in our early 40s, like I've taken to saying the first symptom of perimenopause is denial, but there's the not knowing and there's denial. But a lot of people do know. And I came across some young women recently who were 10 years younger than me, and they were finding every other reason for what was going on, even though they know what I do. So if you can come across those people who are just gently speaking about it, obviously, I don't think you want to say, have you thought you're about perimenopause for why you are the way you are? But I think in your book, you just mentioned gently working it into the conversation, gently dropping hints about it, just getting it up higher in the mind. Obviously, if you're one-on-one, when someone's complaining to you directly about some things they're going through, but is that the way you think of going about it? Like peppering into your class, even if there's guys in there, even if there's
Yeah. Totally, if there's guys in there. Now, I have to say that I have about two guys in all of my classes, so it's
Love
not
it.
that much of an issue. They're all very conversant with vulvas and vaginas by now, which is great, and pelvic floors and whatnot. It depends, right? If you're running a yoga for menopause workshop, you know that people are coming because they know they're in perimenopause or postmenopause, and so we can be quite open there, and we start with the information support method, which is helping people understand menopause more, really peppering in those aha moments, like that women may not have heard of, that their oxytocin may be less effective, and therefore they may be finding that they don't they're wondering if they've fallen out of love with their partner, or they're very impatient with their children. Their mothering instinct is really depleted. And that aha moment for women that helps them forgive themselves. They know that it's not them becoming a harridan, it's them having less of that hormone that makes us want to bond with flippin' other humans who are really annoying anyway. So there's always some aha moments in there that make women feel less alone and less hard on themselves. And then the information support method then says, and you're not going to die. And then it says, and here's some tools to help you. And not you're not going to die forever, but this is not going to kill you right now. You're not in danger right now. And here's some tools that will help you. So then if you're talking about a menopause-informed class, where people are not necessarily coming because they are experiencing perimenopause, or they're a mixed age group, or they're mixed genders, you don't want to be pushing it in their face. That would be a little bit like going to a yoga class and your teacher constantly educating you about the fact that you're going to die, something that happens to everybody, and they keep talking about your death, and that's not comfortable. Not obviously that I'm equating perimenopause with death, but if we're in a group where there's mixed genders, mixed ages, that's where it's subtly peppered in, because you could say, let them live in blissful ignorance, but it won't stay blissful for long. The ignorance might stay, but the bliss won't. And particularly with that stage that is not so commonly recognized, the late reproductive stage, which has mostly been researched in terms of fertility and less researched in terms of the symptoms that women experience before their periods change. And because their periods aren't changing, they don't put it down to perimenopause. Their doctor doesn't, it isn't perimenopause. They don't put it down to the approach of perimenopause. Their doctor doesn't put it down to the approach of perimenopause. So they don't have answers, and they're scared. They may have heightened libido, low libido. They may have anxiety, but lots of energy. They may have sleeplessness, but desire to change their lives. And they're deeply confused. Or they may just be having heavy bleeding. So what I encourage the teachers that I train to do is to try and mention it maybe in relationship to themselves, or just as they're talking through a sequence of moves or whatever, saying, gosh, I did this training yesterday or recently, and I was amazed to discover that there's this time before our periods change where we can feel full of energy. If you're feeling energized today, come and do this, or, use their own experience if they're women, and they can talk about their experience. And to speak about it in ways that don't single out Mary at the back of the class, who you as a teacher really know is very likely to be in that place. So it's a general conversation as much as possible, referring to oneself if that is relevant, if that can be true, or a sister or a friend or whatever, to keep it gentle, but as you say, bring it up to the surface so that women are able in bits and drips and drabs to be drip fed. I'm mixing my metaphors, the information at non-overwhelming levels. Yeah.
You're one of the few people that's talking about the late reproductive stage in the space. And it's one of those things where the more I hear about it, the more I go, that was what was going on. And so anyway, great work on that, because
it's such an aha moment for people.
Yeah. I'm just
and
waiting.
It's a really delicate. What,
Sorry,
Libby?
go ahead. No, go ahead.
It's a really delicate one, because I've worked with people for whom there is shame attached, because it's a time when I've heard a lot of women, I wouldn't say the majority of women, but really finding this, what's disturbing them is a desire to look outside their relationship. And even though they really love their partner, that they're finding themselves, they're transforming into the builders that used to annoy them, that as they walk down the street, the builder would whistle at them and say, nice ass, lady, or whatever. They're now looking at guys going, ooh, nice ass. And it makes a lot of sense, because if it is the late reproductive stage, it's the body's desire to make another offspring. And even if you are if you're not straight, if you're not desirous of having children, or you're not able to have children, there will still be this urge. And I feel this sense of restlessness in a lot of women, need to change. But the one that's related to relationships is shameful for people. They maybe have an affair or they want to have an affair. And to help them understand that in a compassionate way is something that nobody does, because everybody just says, that's bad. You're a bad person. But actually, you are being ferociously driven by your hormones. So it's never just about hot flashes and sleeplessness. It's about a whole existential thing that women can feel really alone and really confused. So it's a big passion of mine, the late reproductive stage.
That's great that you dropped that. When I think of, I've done yoga for since I was 30, like decades, and I think of all the things I've learned from the really good teachers I've had, like just beautiful gems. And they were little things like just what you said. They weren't a sermon delivered at the end of the yoga class with a book, and they were just little droplets, and sometimes about
Yeah.
relationships, sometimes about your body. So I think that's just the best way to do it. And two things you mentioned that I realized that have happened to me, like you mentioned being adjusted and not wanting to be adjusted and bothered, and or someone come over and forcing me to do a pose I've clearly decided not to do. Crow is something that I've just decided that I don't want to do. I've tried it many times. I find it really confronting, and I've argued with myself about it for 10 years. And in recent years, I'm like, I just don't want to do it. I just don't want to do it. And I've had, younger teachers come over and make a big deal and lean down. Do you want to just give it a try? And then I want to say, I'm 50 years old. Don't you think I would try if I wanted to try? I'm standing here not trying. So that's one thing. No, I'm not doing it.
Oh, God. That is so wonderful to hear from a non-yoga teacher's perspective. Yeah.
Really?
And I've been there. I've been that girl on the mat going, the whole idea of yoga is that you should be trying everything and you should want to put your leg behind your head. And I remember seeing a video of people being adjusted by a very famous yoga teacher, a big lineage yoga teacher, and they're lying on their back, right? And lying on their back, they then tuck each foot behind their head. Okay, so they're now lying like a turtle on its back. Okay, rolling around on a rounded spine, literally like a turtle on its back, unable to move. And the teacher has come and sat on their hips to get to push their feet behind their head, like groin to groin, face to face, pushing the feet behind the head, and then walking away. And these yogis are sitting there or lying there on their back like a turtle upside down. And the only way they can get out is to drag their foot badoing from behind their head and drag the other foot badoing. And there's a principle, there's very few principles about asana, about postures in the yoga, the closest we have to yoga scriptures. But Stirham Sukham is the Sanskrit for effort and effortlessness. And there is nothing that I see in something like that denotes effortlessness. And the effort is the ridiculous effort of somebody else having to put you into a position. But there would have been a time 15 years ago that I would have looked at that and gone, I wish my teacher would do that for me. And there is no logic to it. And crow pose, for example, I would used to teach. I don't teach it anymore, not least because it's very difficult to do with any kind of cartilage fragility will give you a very strong sense of pressure and discomfort in the hips, even if it's not pain, because cartilage doesn't have nerve endings. You don't feel the pain until the cartilage is already damaged, unfortunately. And it's also very rounded. To get that hip position, most people would be very rounded in the spine. And I always teach a bone safe practice, and flexion in the spine is not really safe for low bone density. And also there's the potential falling flat on your nose, which I used to just joke about. And you'd go, okay, the worst that can happen is you break your nose. And that's pretty bad. But we'd put cushions under the face in case you fall flat on your face and laugh about it. And yes, as a younger yogi, that was fun to try, just as like when I was 10, I used to love doing cartwheels and backflips and stuff. But I don't feel the need, there's no adrenaline rush I get. I don't get the same adrenaline rush from postural achievement now as I used to. And I think that yoga tends to deny that there is an adrenaline rush, there is an ego massage to achieving certain postures. But what I would say is that the teacher that comes off and goes, "Are you sure I can't help you try that?"
Yeah.
She really feels like she's being inclusive.
Mhm.
But actually, true inclusivity is allowing people to not want to do it the same as you and not have the same goals for their body. For me, the goal for most people once we reach midlife is to stay functional, to stay capable of walking our dog, maybe having sex if we have a lovely partner, to stay capable of reaching the beans from the top shelf and tying our shoelaces. And it's those kind of achievements become less of a big deal. And it really bothers me now, Anne Marie, the whole new narrative on what successful aging is. I did air quotes there for any non-video listeners. Successful aging now seems to be being able to, in the yoga world, do all the yoga asana when you're 90, the yoga postures when you're 90. In the personal training world, it's being able to lift like bars that are so heavily weighed the bar is bending with a belt around your waist to stop your abdomen exploding. And then in the kind of somewhere in the middle, there's like a fabulous woman doing a handstand and then putting herself feet first into her car window to sit into her car seat from a handstand outside the car. And this is successful aging. And for me, that's the extreme. That's the people who have genetically bendy capability or they spend their entire lives in the gym. And the reality is that for most of us, we're not going to do any of that. And I would just like to keep us ticking along doing the things we love to do. We don't have to be superhuman. It's like successful aging now is what Wonder Woman would be currently. Do you remember her?
Yeah, do I remember her? I loved her. Get angry about it. I've got quite a lot of rage. I think I'm going to do a solo episode about it because it just reminds me of the bar that I've been chasing my entire life that just moves as
Yes.
soon as I get to it. And I'm even feeling like I'm going to cry with rage about it because acceptable. And
Yeah.
it's in so many forms. And all these people who are trying to help us and provide information are moving it, always moving it. And so now you have influencers in the perimenopause space who have gotten so jacked. They're doing like almost bodybuilder like poses in high heels. And again, this is not what most of us are going to do. And these clips that go around from men who I like, whose podcasts I listen to, doctors, etc., saying you're not going to, the way you can tell if we're going to be able to open a jar when we're 80 is if we can farmer carry 3/4 of our weight for a
Oh,
minute now. Like I literally, that's what I saw Dr. Peter Attia doing. I am so, every time I work out, I become enraged
yeah.
because I'm up there in my gym working out, just spitting mad about it. And I think
Mm.
it's because of this. I think it's just, it's like there's some plan to just make women just never feel like we can get there. And
Yeah,
yoga is part of it.
exactly.
Yeah.
And
Do you,
and yes, yoga is a big part of it, unfortunately. And yoga teachers very, I think quite innocently often just go with that narrative and don't realize who they might be excluding. Like you'll definitely get yoga teachers saying, if you can do this now, you're going to live longer. That get up from the floor with your feet crossed and don't use your hands test. And nobody is thinking of the people who live in wheelchairs and they're saying if you can do this now you're going to live a long life, and then somebody who can't even get up off a seat because they're immobile and you're saying, oh, you can't do that and you don't even have a hope of doing that. The
funny? It's not funny, but
exclusivity
it's
of it.
crazy. Yeah, you're right. No one in a wheelchair has ever lived into old age. No
Yeah.
one. What do you think about this lift heavy thing that's reached quite an apex? Or maybe it hasn't. Maybe it's going to come more. What do you think about that from your research and everything?
Yes, I work a lot with osteoporosis. I get very angry at the claims that the yoga world makes about its ability to prevent or reverse osteoporosis when we know that even with more research protocols, reversing osteoporosis is extremely difficult, and yoga is simply not robust enough as a physical practice to reverse osteoporosis. Now, it can be really supportive of reducing the likelihood of the complications of osteoporosis, i.e., fracture, by safe practices, but also some practices that can help to reduce fracture, like really working on back strength, really working on posture, proprioception, ability to step to the side, in front and behind us to catch ourselves if we're falling, and just general strength to which reduces the risk of fracture, but also body awareness, so that if we do go and lift in the gym, we're much more likely to lift safely because we can really feel where our joints are in space. We may get a better idea of when is a good idea to stop. If we're overdoing something, we feel exhaustion maybe more keenly. We might feel pain signals more readily because our interoception, our awareness of our body, is much better. But it certainly cannot go strong enough to build bone density from the multiple rich and conclusive studies that show what physical activity actually builds bone. It also reduces, yoga is known to reduce stress and cortisol, and stress can deplete bone density. So it has that on its side as well. But I have osteoporosis. Most of the people I work with are yoga teachers, and many of them have osteoporosis. It certainly anecdotally it does not play out, and any of the studies that have suggested otherwise are far, terrifyingly far from watertight, really flawed. And yet there is a myth going around in the yoga world that yoga can reverse osteoporosis and reduce the likelihood of developing it. What we do know is that lifting fairly heavy is the gold standard for improving bone density in people whose bone density is apparently lower than optimal. And that is mostly around an intense lifting regime of about 80% of your 1 rep max. So if you can lift 100 kilos, which I don't know anyone who can personally, I'm sure there's lots of people who can, once, then you do your work at 80 kilos, so 80%. Nobody try and lift 100 kilo listening to this podcast, by the way. Disclaimer alert. And that does seem to be fairly conclusive in terms of building bone. There is also some research suggesting that about 70% moderate intensity can also help, but it's not as conclusive as that higher level. And it is incremental. This for muscle, and it's the same for bone, that once that weight becomes really manageable for you, you have to go up to make it more difficult again. And that's what I don't see as sustainable for women, not women and men, just because of the lives we lead. I don't see myself lifting heavier and heavier till I'm 80. I don't have the time. I don't have the joy in it. I don't know. I'm already seeing going to a personal trainer and lifting kettlebells for the first time in my life for the last year and a half. And I already am incurring more injuries than I have in the 25 years of yoga practice. And yoga can injure, of course, but I can feel my body does not respond as beautifully in terms of safety in doing it, but I know my bones need it. I also know that strength matters aside from bones. So strength helps a little bit, muscular mass helps a little bit with metabolism, not as much maybe as some people are saying. I'm not interested in metabolism for weight loss. I'm interested in metabolism for glucose metabolism and that kind of thing, and energy, to keep those hormones functioning optimally. But also strength matters for fall reduction in later life. And we know that even without osteoporosis, it can be a late life fall that ends up being the end of someone's life, which I think is a kind of sad way to go because of the operations and all that kind of stuff. But also core strength helps us regulate our nervous system. So there's amazing research into the fact that they don't know exactly why yet, but that in the sensory motor cortex, there's a lot of information about your core muscles. And in the same region, there's a lot of neurological connection to your adrenal glands. And so they believe that the reason they do know that core strength has a direct positive impact on our ability to regulate our nervous system. And they think that's the reason, but it doesn't matter what the reason is, that we know that having a strong core can help our nervous system. And for me, the thing that I would like to help women with the most really in perimenopause is nervous system regulation, so that you're not adding to the hormonal struggles by this heightened anxiety, heightened nervous system. But also we know that in later life, the HPA axis, the nervous system regulation axis, can be upregulated for men and women as they get older. And I just hate the idea of, in the years when I'm supposed to be chilling out and enjoying, I don't know, maybe grandchildren if I have them, or going hiking with the hiking group, that I would be struggling with anxiety. I just don't want that for our elder years. So anything, that's where I think strength matters. I don't necessarily feel that it needs to be, for those reasons, lifting super heavy. I think Pilates would maintain core strength enough. And everybody says this about do your movement because you love it, but there has to be an element of enjoyment, or it simply won't be sustainable. You can certainly work for 3 months or 6 months and become one of those people you talked about in the high heels doing the bodybuilder stance at the age of 65. Absolutely, you can. But are you truly the kind of person who's going to maintain that? And therefore, what's the value? Is it a quick fix value? And then if you enjoy it, cool. But as important as strength is, we've got to do it in a way that we're going to continue it on, because there's no point in being strong for 5 years and then just dropping it all.
Yeah. And I also wonder, I think for myself, I remember I always was like, I'm going to get ripped and then I'm going to show it on social media. And then it's just in the last couple of years, I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. I'll probably get in, not ripped, but I'll probably get in some good shape again. And I'm not showing it to anyone, because why would I do that? Like, it's that gentle pulling in of pleasing yourself over trying to impress other people that happens in menopause has shifted that for me. And so sometimes when I see it, I guess I'm being a bit judgmental, but I think, I don't know if this is more about some sort of internal. It's so weird to talk about someone who's doing something healthy, but a lot of that showiness, again, this is just one of the things about social media that I'm not sure about, is showing off your bod.
Yeah, but I don't know how
If
healthy.
you want to show off your bod, it's cool.
There are lots of ways of being healthy, and what's the motivation is also a relevance to whether something is healthy. What's going on in that person's mind? How much time are they spending with their family? How much is it healthy that they are only eating to build muscle mass and not eating for joy, or just not eating intuitively? Is it healthy that they're probably in the gym more than they are in bed? There's a bigger story behind every dramatic quote unquote success story, or every health story. There's obsession, and there's, gosh, time poverty and injury. There's injury. There's no question, but those people will have had injury on the way there. And yes,
Yeah.
if they want to do it, absolutely. Just if a gymnast wants to do gymnastics all their lives, but there's certain areas of physical endeavor. I would say that bodybuilding to that level is a physical endeavor. It's not really a health pursuit, bodybuilding. Staying strong and lifting weights is a health pursuit, but bodybuilding, no. And I think that there's a lot of stuff put under the umbrella as a health promoting activity, and really it is either fun or it is egoic. And we all have egos, but I think to equate those images with health is to forget about things like, anyone who does gymnastics as a profession does so in the knowledge that they'll pay for it later life with dodgy knees. Anyone who does rugby knows they'll pay for it in later life with brain injury. There's payoffs, and there's some areas of the wellness world that don't admit the risks associated. Yeah.
We're not only athletes get old, right? Not only regular people get old who garden and do their groceries, they get old too. Okay, so some of the emotional journey that we go through, I've certainly spent my share of time crying in yoga. Do you ignore the crying? Does the teacher ignore the crying?
Oh, teachers are very different about the crying. I used to want my yoga students to cry, because I remember when I went to yoga first, I spent most of the time crying, and it felt like this spectacular release. And I had this notion that I was eventually going to be cured of all my mental and emotional baggage, because I would lie in a certain position over a bolster with my chest exposed and weep. And I would expect that when I left that class, that all lifetimes of issues were going to be resolved, but actually they weren't. And I still needed some psychotherapy, and I still have, am I allowed to swear on your podcast?
Yeah, swear
Yeah, I
away.
still have shit that I will always bring with me forever and ever. And, but it was this sort of almost gratifying search for the gratification of emotional release. And I first came to body movement, mind body practices through the tears I shed on the floor of an Alexander technique class where I was getting hands-on from the teacher, and I remember thinking, this is the grief of my parents' death coming out in this physical release. And I think there was something in that and the expertness of her hands, and she was older than me and she was a figure of authority. She was the head of the drama school I was in, and it felt very safe. And I remember thinking, wow, movement can really do stuff that goes beyond words. And I decided it was about the grief of my parents. It may not have been. And I think that's what I've learned over the years is that when we have these emotional releases, we don't need to give them names. They are just emotions being released. And they could be emotions from when you were a toddler or a baby and you were learning to crawl and your mum left the room to go get your nappy and you thought she was gone forever just as you were learning to crawl, and that built into the tension that of the strength you were building in your muscles. And letting go of the emotional trauma you experienced when your mum left the room to get your nappy is not, it's not that big a deal. But I think there is an endless supply of things we can cry about. And when we relax physiologically, those tensions that we're holding let go and the barriers melt, or not even the bad, like it's not even bad barriers. It's to do life, we can't go around crying all day long or giggling all day long. So we hold it in, even if we're not consciously holding it in. And when we relax, it can bubble up. And especially if it's in a safe and nurturing space, especially I think when there is hands involved, when someone is giving you some, holding your head or something like that. And I don't see any harm in it. And I also don't think it is an indication of the quality of your practice. So if you cry, if you don't cry, it's fine. And then regarding what the teachers do, as I said, used to want my students to cry. And if they didn't, I thought I wasn't giving them a rich enough experience. Now it doesn't need to be everything. Not everyone needs to cry. But what does bother me is it usually now happens with perimenopause, it seems to happen more in the sharing circles when people are speaking in a yoga for menopause workshop and they need to speak. And what bothers me more is a teacher who, when someone cries when they're speaking, will interrupt and say, it's okay, you're fine, look at you, you're fabulous. Or even just bringing the box of tissues while the person is in the middle of speaking and crying, or putting a hand on their back. No, you need to just let that person be in that moment, having something that she may never have in any other space because her husband, her children, her wife, her parents, her friends wanted to stop because they're afraid for her. In a yoga class or a sharing circle, she just gets to go, this is so awful, this is so crap. And she doesn't have to mop up her snot or stop her
Yeah.
tears with the tissue. So that's what bothers me. And there are definitely teachers who don't, because of a lack of life experience, I think, and a lack of teaching experience, and they can get that experience, are afraid to let it carry on. But the thing is that most intense emotions last for a very short time and then shift. So if you've ever been in major grief, you know that you're bawling, crying for a minute, and then the next minute you're laughing, and then the next minute you're just sitting there in a blob, and then you're crying again. So we know that if somebody starts to fall apart during a sharing circle, she'll get through it. It'll all dry up and she'll be ready for the next person to speak. So it's allowing it without fear is, I think, key, and allowing it not to need a reason, I think, are two.
Takes a powerful person because, well, I've learned I have to have that ability to hold that space for myself before I was able to hold it for other people. So it just makes people
Yes.
I just think it makes people uncomfortable. And so if you're in that space with someone like you, that is special indeed. Okay, you had this line where you said, as difficult as it can be, perimenopause could be seen as a gift. It shows a woman what needs to be done. And I know you're talking about body, but it's also emotionally, spiritually. What do you mean by that? It shows a woman what needs to be done.
As you say, it's everything. So I think what it is that so many things, and I may forget some of them. The first thing that springs to mind is, of course, the body, that the level of energy that we've expected, the doing that we've been engaging in becomes less sustainable in a body that has a bit of vulnerability. And so it starts to make noises at us like achy knees or fatigue or a lack of desire even to go and do the things that we've needed to do. Or maybe it will give us different signals like social anxiety if we're just on the go too much. So I think the physical body and the nervous system will start to give us signals about its needs. And usually those needs are to reduce the pressure. And whether that's the physical pressure or the metaphorical life pressure. I believe that before menopause, or at least it's something that I'm playing with at the moment, is that rather than perimenopause being a time of low capacity and reduced capacity, it's a time of true capacity. And that before menopause, the reproductive hormones have been making us tolerate living beyond capacity. And we know that burnout, actually, the majority of burnout happens in our 30s, not in perimenopause. And at least those are the statistics I most recently read. And so burnout happens because we're living at beyond capacity. But for most of us, I don't know, you could say luckily, estrogen and progesterone have such buffering effects that it allows us to live beyond capacity. And when we don't have them, we are left really seeing what our true capacity is. And that does things like gives us driving anxiety. Because for me, driving is something that deserves anxiety. It is a dangerous thing to do. And so maybe you're just waking up to, oh, actually, this isn't this free thing that I can just do without worrying. It's the difference between a young guy driving a car and a 70-year-old guy driving a car. It happens to us all. We get more cautious because we have these realizations. It's social anxiety. It's wanting to leave your job. It's maybe never wanting to cook a meal for everybody again. It's getting more annoyed at housework. It's all telling us that something needs to shift. And then on an emotional level, I'm sure you've done loads of research into this. We're seeing more of that connection to trauma, and that if we've had an adverse childhood experience, that perimenopause can be more difficult. If we have had a trauma, it tends to bubble up. So in much the same way we were talking about crying in yoga, and some of your listeners may know that what we do when we've had a trauma is we package it away into different parts of our brain because it's too hard to keep it in our memory as a whole. So we package it away in little pockets to deal with a bit at a time to make it more manageable. But the only way we can do that is by having a robust system that manages to keep it in those pockets till we feel strong enough to deal with it. And so in perimenopause, again, it's that capacity to manage is depleted, and we're coming to there's a sort of, it's not a great piece of evolution that at a time when we could really do without being confronted with our traumas, they tend to bubble up and we are having to confront things that we maybe haven't dealt with before. And then also, I was having a very interesting conversation on a webinar I was running last night about autism and perimenopause, and how a lot of women are being diagnosed with autism and ADHD in perimenopause for the first time. And the woman who asked the question was saying, how do we differentiate between what's my neurodivergence and what's my perimenopause? And my response was, does it actually matter? Because the ways in which we deal with either of those things can be similar. Because for me, what perimenopause is showing us that needs to be done is that we need to deal with our nervous system differently. It is more sensitized, just like I have a daughter who's autistic, and I see that her nervous system baseline is set higher. And so for her, something that might take an hour to distress someone who's neurotypical takes 5 minutes, and she needs to exit the room and go and be on her own. And caring for an autistic person is about caring for their nervous system and how they react to the world. And for me, that's the same as caring for someone in perimenopause. It's like really listening to our nervous system now, which has a different setting, and we need to see what needs to be done in terms of that neurological reaction. And that is often, for example, a woman now needs a man cave in the way that she might have understood men did. She needs more time on her own. She's not the socialite she used to be. Things that dysregulate her are just more obvious. So there's so many levels. So it's emotional, it's trauma, it's nervous system, it's physical, it's practical in terms of life demands. Um, but it is a gift to just elbow the bloody world out of the way in terms of the demands it's been making and the demands we've accepted. Let's not make it all about other people's fault, because it's been a societal choice that this is what women do, and some men do it too. But it is, yeah, we elbow the world out of the way and can, if we choose to, discover what actually is doable and sustainable, I think.
Yeah, it forces us to look at what, I mean, when I read that line, I thought, yeah, it forces you to look at everything and why you do everything and how it's working. And I think it's a gift too. So I know that you have, I know knowing what you've said, and I know just from following you that you have thoughts about the narrative, because the hormones that protect you and recede and leave you exposed, that has been morphed into a sort of a narrative that this is something that shouldn't be happening. And it creates a sort of permanent situation, and that it creates a vulnerability emotionally, but also physically, that just continues until you're a decrepit older person. And I wondered what your thoughts are on, am I saying the narrative right? Do you think the extreme part of the narrative?
Yeah. Yeah, there is a lot of polarization in the menopause space as we're starting to talk about it. And it distresses me because it is a polarization that doesn't need to happen, because particularly what I love about menopause is that it has made me feel that I am less other than the people I used to think were different from me and irrelevant and invisible, and I would never be them, aka older women,
Mm.
where they were these like a whole other species, and I would never be them or would never be like them. And that's another piece of the sentence from my book that you just read, is that it forces you to be aware of your own mortality, because you start to feel the aches and the creaks and whatnot. And suddenly this body that has seemed invincible is showing you that it is not. And one of the most beautiful words I ever heard somebody else mentioning about what menopause is like is that it is a tenderizing time, and that it makes you more tender towards other people. And for me, it is also a humbling time where I woke up almost overnight, not quite overnight. I had a barometer of it in an annual festival I used to go to. I still go to, where one of the events was a big five rhythms dance meditation in a huge big teepee with loads of drums, really wild. And I started going in my 40s when I was having that wild, heightened energy of the late reproductive stage. And I would be dancing, dancing, dancing with all the 30-something-year-old beauties in the tent, and they'd be seeing me and I'd be seeing them. And we were in the gang together, even though I was like 5, 10 years older. And as my perimenopause developed and I started to feel it was really energy that I couldn't stay dancing as frenetically for as long, I would get knackered. I started noticing that they were turning away because I wasn't dancing as wildly. And I was like, for a while, I was like, please see me, let me dance with you, let me dance with you. Until one year, like this is the overnight piece, one year I just couldn't do it anymore. And I remember almost literally turning around and noticing suddenly all the other people in the tent that were my age and older and dancing with them. And I saw them, the women that had been invisible to me as I
Wow.
became invisible to the younger people, the women that
Yeah.
had been invisible to me became visible to me. And it was beautiful and it was difficult because, of course, they varied from 45 to 75. So I do think we have to admit that there is a trajectory that we are
Mhm.
all on, of life and death, of birth and death. And as much as you might strength train or do yoga and lift ridiculously heavy when you're 80 or do the splits and the headstand when you're 80, there is also part of you that is not getting stronger. And eventually the body does give up. Of course it does. And that's a really difficult thing to say when you're trying to speak to the empowered menopause. Because I don't think the empowered, fabulous menopause is any truer than the falling apart menopause. And for some people, it does feel wildly empowering. And for some people, it does feel like falling apart, absolutely. But the general truth is in the middle. And even for the people who are wildly empowered, I feel like in a way, there is a certain level of the denial you were talking about earlier when we were just talking about the late reproductive stage and how do we help people understand when they're in denial. And there can be that camp in the holistic world where, and I had this from one of the yoga teachers on the webinar last night, saying that she has met yoga teachers who, because they're feeling so healthy and they do all their yoga and they do this and do that, they were judgmental and mistrustful of her difficult experience. They didn't believe her and they thought if she just did more yoga, she would be fine, or if she did this holistic practice or connected spiritually, she'd be fine. I feel that's a kind of denial of the difficulty of menopause because, of course, stuff is going to go on. But the idea that we are helpless and falling apart is clearly untrue also. And I see the majority of people that I know who are not on hormone therapy are fine. They're ticking along. Of course, they've got little bits and bobs that are going a bit pear-shaped, but the majority of people I know who are on hormones also have bits and bobs that are going pear-shaped. And so I see that I don't quite understand because I've never experienced it in my my clients, students, friends. I don't understand the people who say that HRT has been this extraordinary gift and they feel utterly fabulous. I wonder if there is a lack of ability to speak about the stuff that's still difficult because we all want the thing that we found to be the thing. And then I think that in that menopause is a deficiency disease and a disaster camp, they won't tolerate conversation that HRT is not perfect. They feel that people just don't have the right dose or they all this kind of thing if it's not perfect for them.
It's
So
developing. It's a developing story that we're
it
watching, right? And we're
is.
seeing it. And when you say that, the only time I see this miraculous transformation is when people weren't sleeping and they start to sleep. And that's understandable.
Oh,
If you're not sleeping and you haven't been sleeping for a very long time, you're going to get worn down into a cardboard box. And if you start taking hormone therapy and you can sleep, that's a miracle because we all know.
yeah.
So that's like, I think that's a part of it. And it's a big piece. But yeah, I'm with you. It's very confusing. And the problem
Yeah,
with
but
comparities is people don't tolerate. You're right. People don't tolerate. And this is why I get pressure also from people who, when I do talk about hormone therapy, because there's people who don't think you need hormone therapy and
yeah, there's
that no one needs it.
evangelists.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that no one needs
evangelists
it.
on both sides. Yeah, yeah.
Yes. And
And it's a
so
pharmaceutical conspiracy.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I can't discount the people who are helped by it. I just cannot. But I
No.
also can't stop talking about the fact that there are side effects and a lot of people who don't take it and they're fine. And it's a choice. It's like you're not dumb because you don't take it. You're just making decisions. But it's interesting. It's really interesting to be in this at this time. What is your yoga top tip for one of the big problems that women have perimenopause that they could take away that would help them?
Oh gosh, so it's funny because in normal yoga, for me there isn't really a top tip except let's say, okay, let me do two top tips. One's for normal yoga and one's for yoga for menopause.
Okay.
Top tip for normal yoga, I would think try and get some tuition in or study yourself or go to a teacher who teaches breath practices. So in terms of yoga in general, the best research results come from when you're doing postures, breathing practices, and meditation together. There is zero research that tells you that one yoga posture is going to do anything for anybody. There, you will see articles in magazines which will be like top 5 poses for menopause, and it's bunkum. And some of them are not safe for people who have issues in menopause, like cartilage fragility or low bone density. And they don't, oh, yeah, I could share some stuff with you from deep in the yoga world that makes a mockery of the whole idea of claiming specific benefits from specific postures. There is no one best posture. The only single things that have amazing results from the yoga world are particular breath practices. And they have different amazing results. So there's a breath practice called Kapalabhati, which is good for helping with pelvic floor prolapse. There is a breath practice called Bastrika, which is good for lung function, which can reduce in perimenopause and might affect your energy. And then there is left nostril breathing, just lightly closing your right nostril and always breathing through your left, not forever in your whole life, but as a meditation breath practice, which helps to down regulate the nervous system. If you need energy, breathing through the right nostril does seem to upregulate the nervous system. So these are proper research studies that have got these benefits. And then just deep breathing of any sort is good for nervous system regulation. And this is key for perimenopause. However, if breathing practices make you feel like anxious or you feel a little bit of your post-traumatic stress coming up, then it's not for you, of course. But they are the most jaw-dropping things to me from yoga, is the benefits of breath practices. And then in Yoga for Menopause, we teach a lot about trying to re-find your trust in your own body through the nervous system, through moving led by your body rather than led by your teacher, and staying really closely attentive to the physiological sensations that you're having while you're moving. So I think yoga practices can be very disembodied. If a teacher is telling you to do crow, or they're telling you to put your foot here and your hand there and turn your head this way and do 6 breaths and blah, 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 we can do it very externally and we're not actually feeling it, especially if it's a vinyasa class where you're moving quickly from posture to posture and you don't get a time to inhabit it. So in Yoga for Menopause, we have sections that are very strong, but we have sections that are very sensual, somatic, from the somatics modality, which is simple repetitive movements that you approach through the lens of looking for pleasure and avoiding pain, which is what the nervous system wants. So you're immediately bringing the nervous system with you. And that while you're in this repetitive movement, you give yourself permission to change it if your body has a desire to change it. So it feels a bit more like a Sunday morning yawn stretch that you do instinctually in bed than trying to go to specific goals. So that top tip, if I could condense it, is about pleasurable practices that give your body the permission to speak its needs before you impose something from the outside.
I think a lot of women are probably like I was, where how many yoga classes did I do where I entered the room and it's like I came to at the end of the yoga class. I wasn't in my body. My brain
Yeah.
was all over the place. And I treated it like something I applied to myself, but I
Mm.
almost wasn't there. And that's how I lived. And I think a lot of us live like that. Getting into your
Anne
body.
Marie, you would be pretty unique in recognizing that.
Mm.
Most people think I did a really embodied yoga practice because they sweated and they got the postures right or whatever, and they were nice and
Well,
relaxed in their shavasana afterwards.
I just talked about this on the podcast recently, but in 2019, I dislocated both my shoulders in puppy pose. And so that was my wake up call, because
Mm.
that's how I exercised. That's how I did yoga. And I over exercised all the time. And when I dislocated my shoulders, why did that happen? Only because I wasn't there. I
Yeah,
wasn't present. My, my body was doing the work. And
yeah.
so that was, I think the world has a way of showing you things and making you. So I didn't come to it on my own. I'd probably still be doing it.
I'm so
Yeah.
glad your shoulder's better.
They're good. They're
Yeah,
good. And
that's an
I'm
indication of the need of strength, right?
certainly, and I'm not a big fan of, there's a lot of people who are like, you injured. I think when you injure yourself, you need to be cognizant and careful, but I also think you can heal, because I heard a lot of, oh, once you do your shoulders, you're screwed. Like I hear a lot of that kind of talk about the body. When you hurt that, it's all done for. And I'm like, is it? Because everyone told me my shoulders would be ruined, and they're pretty okay. I'm
Yeah,
careful, but
no. And the thing
think
is,
about them.
Yeah, they're okay, and some people's aren't, and that's the luck of the draw. Some men's shoulders aren't okay, and some men's shoulders are fine. It's not all menopause. Menopause gets a black name for everything. We like to
Yeah.
put aging into the menopause bracket because that makes us able to blame something and get annoyed about it rather than accept that we're actually aging. And cartilage does get more delicate. It gets you're more likely to have a cartilage injury. You also have stiffer tissues. We lay down more collagen in the tissue that we want to be loose, but then we lose collagen from our skin. There's a couple of things where I'm like, this is mad. Evolution really got it wrong here. And sometimes you recognize that it is all about evolution, and evolution doesn't give a toss about how comfortable you are in your old age. It's all about how many humans can we get on this planet, how many ants, how many birds, whatever. And so we have to deal with the consequences. And the truth is that, yes, our practice has to change. We can't throw ourselves around the place as robustly as the young people. And they
Oh,
can
but
have
there's
their time in
benefit.
the sun.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that story about you dancing and turning around. It's so dramatic. It should be in a movie. That should be a movie scene. I would
I'd
love to.
love to do that movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would
Yeah.
love that. Okay. Thank you so much, Niamh. It's been so lovely to speak with you in this magical book that you've produced and how much you're helping. And it's so interesting to see people helping in all these areas. It's just,
It's important.
yeah, it's really neat. I love you and the other woman who was doing the same thing as you, the pyramids that were being built in different parts of the world at the same time. There's a
Oh,
collective.
yeah.
No, that's what
Yeah.
I thought of when you were saying it. I'm always amazed at history when they're saying, no, this was happening in this other part of the world. And I'm like, magical.
And then there's the other thing about some species of monkeys that evolved at the same time, that they lived on separate islands and never connected to each other and seemed to be learning how to use tools at the same rate and stuff. That
Of
kind of,
these examples through history, just mind blowing. Just,
yeah,
of course,
amazing.
we're all connected in a way because otherwise, that's just,
It
really,
needed to happen.
yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome, and thank you.
Hot Flash Inc. was created and is hosted by Anne Marie McQueen, produced and edited by Sonia Mack. The information contained in this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and is not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products referenced on the podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem, i.e. menopause or anything else, or any healthcare questions, please promptly see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Anne Marie McQueen and any producers or editors, disclaim any responsibility from any possible adverse effects from the use of any information contained herein. Opinions of guests on this podcast are their own, and the podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about a guest's qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is owned by Hot Flash Inc. Media.